Idaho College Murders Part 2, A Night of Terror. Weeks passed with no answers. The town of Moscow lived in fear. Students abandoned campus and parents demanded justice. Police were silent, the community was restless, and rumors filled the gap left by official statements. But behind the scenes, investigators were carefully following the evidence. DNA left on a knife sheath, a white car captured on cameras, and cell phone data pointing to late-night surveillance. All of it led to one man, Bryan Kohberger. This is the story of the investigation, the arrest, and the long fight for justice that still continues. Previously, in Part 1, we followed the lives of 4 University of Idaho students, Kaylee, Maddie, Zana, and Ethan. We saw their final night, a bar downtown, a food truck stop, a fraternity party, and the return to the house on King Road. By morning, all 4 were gone. The discovery shocked the small town of Moscow, Idaho. Students fled campus, parents pulled their children home, and for weeks there were no answers, only fear. But behind the silence, investigators were quietly piecing together a puzzle. A trail of evidence was about to lead them to a suspect no one expected. This is Part 2 of the Idaho College murders. In the first days after the murders, the Moscow Police Department faced enormous pressure. This was a small-town force, about 36 officers total, now suddenly responsible for one of the most shocking crimes in the nation. Their early statements fueled criticism. At a press conference just hours after the discovery, police told the public they did not believe there was an ongoing threat to the community. But they did not explain why, nor did they identify a suspect. For frightened students and parents, the words rang hollow. How could there be no danger when a killer was still on the loose? The backlash was immediate. Parents pulled their children out of school. Students left campus in droves. Moscow, once vibrant with college life, became eerily quiet. Within days, the FBI was called to assist. More than 60 federal agents joined the investigation, working alongside state police and local detectives. They collected thousands of tips, reviewed hours of surveillance footage, and requested DNA samples from people across the region. Officers even approached male students at the university, asking for voluntary cheek swabs to rule them out. Neighborhood canvasses were conducted door to door. Police asked residents if they had seen anything unusual, a car, a stranger, a sound in the night. Many remembered nothing. Others admitted they hadn't been paying attention at all. Despite the chaos, small pieces of evidence began to emerge. Security cameras. Video from nearby homes and businesses showed a white sedan circling the King Road neighborhood in the early hours of November 13. Investigators couldn't identify the driver, but the car's repeated loops around the area stood out. The dog. Kaylee's puppy Murphy was found unharmed inside the house. Investigators debated whether the killer intentionally spared the dog or simply ignored it. Either way, the detail fascinated both police and the public, raising questions about the killer's mindset. Phone data. Cell tower information suggested unusual activity in the hours surrounding the crime. Phones that normally connected to the network suddenly went dark. Some reappeared miles away, hours later. Meanwhile, online speculation exploded. Amateur sleuths dissected the food truck footage, debating the behavior of strangers in the background. Others posted theories about ex-boyfriends, roommates, or even professors. For investigators, this digital noise was both a help and a hindrance. Some leads came from online chatter, but many were distractions. forcing detectives to waste time chasing false rumors. Local residents felt the impact too. Innocent people were accused on Facebook and TikTok, their names dragged into conspiracy theories without evidence. It was a reminder of how, in the digital age, a tragedy can quickly become a spectacle. Weeks passed with no arrests and pressure mounted, but behind the scenes, investigators were carefully following the evidence trail. The turning point came when forensic teams examined the knife sheath left at the crime scene. On its snap button, they found a single male DNA profile. It wasn't in the national database, but by using genetic genealogy, the same technique that solved the Golden State Killer case, analysts traced the DNA to a family in Pennsylvania. That family connection pointed to one man, Bryan Kohberger, a criminology student living just across the border in Pullman, Washington. Bryan Christopher Kohberger was born in 1994 and grew up in Pennsylvania. On the surface, his childhood seemed ordinary, but classmates and neighbors later recalled hints of struggle. In middle school, Bryan was often described as shy and awkward. By high school, he'd become a target of bullying because of his weight. Students remembered cruel nicknames, whispered comments in hallways, and the isolation that followed. At some point, he decided to change. Bryan lost over 100 pounds, obsessively controlling his diet and exercising relentlessly. The transformation was striking, but friends said it didn't erase his insecurities. Instead, it seemed to replace them with intensity. Some classmates recalled Bryan as distant, even cold. One described him as a guy who watched people more than he talked to them. Another said he often tried to insert himself into conversations, but struggled to connect. He developed an interest in criminal psychology early. Teachers noted his fascination with crime stories and his sharp intelligence. But his curiosity often carried a darker edge. He didn't just want to understand crime, he wanted to understand the criminal mind. Bryan first studied psychology at community college before moving on to a master's degree in criminal justice at DeSales University. Professors remembered him as quiet but capable, deeply interested in academic discussions. At DeSales, he studied under a professor who was a forensic psychologist, fueling his interest in the psychology of offenders. During this time, Bryan conducted an unusual online survey, posted in crime-related forums. The survey asked offenders to describe their thoughts and emotions while committing crimes. What were you thinking and feeling during your crime? How did you plan and prepare? How did you approach your victim? The questions unsettled many who later read them. In hindsight, it felt less like research and more like a window into his own fantasies. In 2022, Bryan moved across the country to attend Washington State University in Pullman, just 15 minutes from Moscow, Idaho. There, he began his PhD in criminology. His professors saw him as intelligent but arrogant. Some classmates described him as controlling in group projects, speaking over others and dismissing opposing views. A few female students said his presence made them uncomfortable. At the same time, Bryan was serving as a teaching assistant for undergraduates in criminal justice. Several students complained about his harsh grading and cold demeanor. One said, "He looked right through you, like you weren't even there." Bryan's fascination with criminal behavior grew more intense. He studied serial killers, criminological theories, and behavioral analysis. He often discussed how criminals think, what drives them, and how police make mistakes. It was as if he wanted to place himself in both roles, the criminal and the one smart enough to catch the criminal. Former classmates said he sometimes steered conversations toward gruesome details of crimes. One recalled him asking whether people who commit murder think about the aftermath, or if they simply act on impulse. To the outside world, Bryan was a student, a teacher, a researcher. But behind the surface, investigators now believe he was planning something darker. Cell phone data later revealed he had driven past the King Roadhouse multiple times in the weeks leading up to November 13th. Sometimes late at night, sometimes in the early morning hours. It looked less like coincidence and more like surveillance. From threads of data and fragments of footage, a clearer picture began to form. By late December, investigators had more than fragments. They had a pattern. Piece by piece, the evidence began to lock into place, and every piece pointed toward Bryan Kohberger. The most critical clue was the knife sheath left on a bed inside the house. Forensic teams had recovered a single male DNA profile from the button snap. At first, there was no match in the national database, but investigators turned to genetic genealogy, the same method that solved the Golden State Killer case. Analysts compared the unknown DNA to public genealogy records and found a likely family link in Pennsylvania. When FBI agents collected trash from the Kohberger family home, they obtained a sample from Bryan's father. The results showed a near-perfect match. The crime scene DNA was overwhelmingly likely to belong to Bryan himself. In court documents, prosecutors later said the probability of it belonging to anyone else was 5.37 octillion to 1, a number so high it was almost absolute certainty. Detectives also studied Bryan's cell phone records. They discovered something chilling. His phone had pinged near the King Roadhouse at least 12 times in the months before the murders. Many of those pings were late at night or in the early morning hours, long before the crime. To investigators, it looked less like coincidence and more like surveillance. Even more suspicious, on the night of November 13th, Kohberger's phone went completely dark between 2:47 a.m. and 4:48 a.m., the exact window of the murders. Investigators called this a digital silence, a common tactic used to avoid detection. But the silence didn't erase his trail. When the phone reconnected later that morning, data showed it had traveled back toward Pullman, Washington, his home base. The final piece was the car. Surveillance footage from multiple locations captured a white Hyundai Elantra circling the King Road neighborhood between 3:29 and 4:20 a.m. The car passed the house at least 4 times before finally stopping in the area. Minutes later, cameras recorded it speeding away at high velocity, heading back toward Washington State. The car was registered to Bryan Kohberger. It was the same vehicle he had driven across the country with his father just weeks later. From threads of data and fragments of footage, a clearer picture began to form. Individually, each clue might have been explained away. A DNA sample without context, a phone ping here and there, a white car like thousands of others. But together, the evidence painted a chilling picture. A criminology student surveilling a house filled with students. A phone that went silent just as the murders occurred. A car caught circling the neighborhood before and fleeing after. DNA left behind on a knife sheath. For investigators, the pattern was undeniable. The suspect was no longer just a name, it was Bryan Kohberger. By late December 2022, investigators had quietly built their case against Bryan Kohberger. The DNA on the knife sheath, the white Hyundai Elantra, and the suspicious phone records all pointed to him. But now came the delicate part, making sure he didn't slip away. Kohberger had left Washington and was driving cross-country with his father, heading back to Pennsylvania for winter break. For days, undercover teams followed them across highways and small towns, never letting them out of sight. Every mile was a risk. What if he realized he was being watched? What if he destroyed evidence? On December 15, 2022, in Indiana, police pulled over Bryan's white Hyundai Elantra not once, but twice within a short period of time. Both stops were for minor traffic violations, tailgating and speeding. Body camera footage shows Bryan in the driver's seat, his father beside him. The conversations seemed routine, almost boring, but many believe the stops were intentional, a way for investigators to observe him up close and capture footage without alerting him to the bigger investigation. The irony was striking. The man accused of meticulously planning a quadruple murder, now calmly explaining himself during ordinary traffic stops, unaware of the net closing around him. When Kohberger arrived at his parents' home in Albrightsville, Pennsylvania, FBI surveillance intensified. Agents tracked his movements, noted his routines, and even collected trash from outside the home to compare DNA samples. Inside the house, Bryan's family reportedly noticed nothing unusual. To them, he was home for the holidays. To investigators, he was the prime suspect in a brutal crime. In the early hours of December 30th, 2022, a SWAT team assembled quietly outside the Kohberger family home. The street was dark, lined with snow. Neighbors were asleep, unaware that one of the biggest arrests of the year was about to unfold. At 1 a.m., heavily armed officers broke through the doors. Flashlights cut through the darkness. Shouts filled the air. Bryan was taken by surprise, pulled from his bed, and handcuffed. The suspect in the Idaho college murders was finally in custody. The scene was surreal. In the hours that followed, neighbors woke to flashing lights and armored vehicles parked outside. Reporters swarmed the small Pennsylvania town, stunned that the man accused of killing 4 students in Idaho had been hiding in plain sight in their community. Kohberger was charged with 4 counts of first-degree murder and 1 count of burglary. Within days, he was extradited to Idaho, flown across the country under tight security. The quiet, calculated criminology student was now the face of one of the most haunting murder cases in America. The arrest of Bryan Kohberger sent shockwaves across the nation. News outlets rushed to Moscow, Idaho, turning the quiet college town into the center of a media storm. Satellite trucks lined the streets. Cameras flashed outside the courthouse. Headlines blared across screens. College town in shock. Who is the killer? For students and parents, the arrest brought little comfort. Fear lingered in classrooms, dorms, and quiet neighborhoods. Candlelight vigils lit up the campus where friends gathered to grieve and hold on to one another. Flowers and photos appeared at the steps of the university, reminders of lives stolen too soon. Television talk shows and online forums filled with speculation. Commentators debated. Was this the work of a serial killer? Was it a crime of obsession or something even darker? Every opinion echoed louder than the last, often blurring the line between fact and rumor. On social media, hashtags like #IdahoCase and #JusticeForVictims trended nationwide. While some posts spread solidarity, others spread suspicion. Innocent people saw their names dragged into conspiracy theories, their lives disrupted by viral accusations. What had begun as a local tragedy had now become a national obsession, an endless echo chamber of grief, speculation, and demand for justice. After his arrest in December 2022, Bryan Kohberger was extradited to Idaho in early January. The community watched as he entered the courtroom for the first time, shackled, dressed in an orange jumpsuit, his face pale and unreadable. The families of the victims sat just feet away, some holding hands, others staring straight ahead, refusing to look away from the man accused of taking their children. Kohberger stood silent as the charges were read. 4 counts of first-degree murder and 1 count of burglary. When asked for his plea, he answered firmly, "Not guilty." Prosecutors made their intentions clear. They would seek the death penalty. They argued that the crime was especially cruel, heinous, and involved multiple victims, all factors that justified the harshest punishment under Idaho law. The defense countered quickly. They claimed that the evidence was circumstantial, that investigators had rushed to judgment, and that alternative suspects had been ignored. They pushed to suppress key evidence, including the genetic genealogy that first identified Kohberger. It was the beginning of a legal chess match that promised to stretch on for years. Every hearing drew national attention. Reporters lined the courthouse steps. True crime followers dissected every detail: his posture, his haircuts, even the way he looked at his lawyers. In court, Kohberger appeared detached, often staring straight ahead or scribbling notes. He rarely looked toward the gallery, where grieving families sat through each proceeding. For the families, the courtroom became a place of both pain and purpose. Kaylee's father spoke to reporters after nearly every hearing, demanding accountability and vowing that his daughter's voice would not be silenced. Ethan's parents described the experience as like losing him again and again every time we walk into that room. Court documents revealed the extraordinary weight of the prosecution's case. DNA. Experts testified that the profile on the knife sheath was 5.37 octillion times more likely to belong to Kohberger than to anyone else on Earth. Cell phone data. Detailed records showed his device pinging near the victim's home in the months before the murders, 12 times in all. Car footage. Surveillance captured his Hyundai Elantra circling the neighborhood repeatedly before the killings, then racing away just after 4:20 a.m. Behavior after the murders. Prosecutors hinted at unusual cleaning activities and comments that raised suspicions during the investigation. The defense fought each point, questioning the reliability of DNA genealogy, the accuracy of cell tower data, and the possibility of contamination at the crime scene. One of the most debated issues has been whether Kohberger should face execution if convicted. Idaho is one of the states that still allows capital punishment, and prosecutors argue that this crime qualifies on every count. But defense attorneys have suggested that seeking the death penalty will drag out the trial for years, forcing the families to endure endless appeals. For some parents, the thought of waiting so long for closure is unbearable. As of now, the trial has been delayed multiple times. Hearings over evidence, motions, and jury selection have stretched the timeline indefinitely. The case may not see a jury until late 2025 or beyond. For the families, each delay is another wound. They sit through hearing after hearing, waiting for answers, waiting for justice, living with a grief that time cannot heal. From the very beginning, the Idaho College murders became not just a case, but a worldwide obsession. Online communities poured over every scrap of information: video clips, police statements, leaked documents. On Reddit, Facebook, and TikTok, thousands of amateur sleuths tried to solve the crime themselves. Some focused on the food truck live stream, dissecting the behavior of strangers in the background. Others spread theories about boyfriends, roommates, even professors. Many of these theories were baseless, and some caused real harm. Innocent people found their names dragged into viral accusations, facing harassment and suspicion with no evidence at all. Even now, one of the most haunting questions remains: why? Some believe Kohberger may have developed an obsession with one of the victims, stalking the house until he finally acted. Others suggest he wanted to prove himself, to commit the perfect crime and outsmart investigators, driven by his own criminology studies. Another theory is that it was about control. Former classmates described him as someone who struggled socially, who often felt invisible. Perhaps the murders gave him a twisted sense of power, the ability to take everything away from people who seemed to have what he lacked: friendships, love, belonging. But without a confession, the true motive remains speculation. National media swarmed Moscow in the weeks after the murders. Satellite trucks lined the streets. Reporters camped outside the courthouse, desperate for updates. Some criticized the coverage for being too sensational, turning real grief into entertainment. Others argued it was necessary, shining a light on a case that demanded answers. For the families, it was a double-edged sword. The attention kept the story alive, ensuring their children would not be forgotten. But it also meant their pain was constantly broadcast, their private moments of grief dissected for strangers to consume. For Moscow, Idaho, the murders left scars that may never fully heal. Students say they no longer feel safe walking home at night. Parents speak of broken trust, the illusion of safety gone forever. The house on King Road still stands, though its windows are boarded, its presence a painful reminder of the night that changed everything. The university has promised to demolish it, turning the land into a memorial. And for the families, life has split into two parts: the time before November 13th, 2022, and the time after. Every secret waits to be revealed. Every silence that carries an echo, every story is waiting to be told. What about yours? What do you think about this case? Share your thoughts in the comments. Every voice matters. Subscribe and step into the echoes of truth.